ready to sit down and listen, please go ahead, Don.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know too much about the subject. I know too much about it. I've had to work to reduce my focus so you would reach it. And some of you may not know what the title is, the Shanks Mayor's Tour. It's a dated title, but it's appropriate. A Shanks Mayor's Tour is a tour or a trip, a piece of travel. It doesn't have to be a mare, it could be a car, in which the direction is driven by what you're riding in, not by the rider. In other words, the context of the events decide where you're going, and your response to that is a consequence of how you react to what happens. And this summarizes to a very great extent not only my personal involvement in Asia, which came not from my initial education, but my deployment there by a military officer. And many of you are old enough to remember MASH. I was stationed in MASH in Korea for 18 months and became entranced not only by Asia, but by the fundamental way the United States was dealing with it. And my story, my autobiography, is really not incidents that affected me and drove me to being not an American businessman, which I always assumed I would become, to being a professor of Asian studies with an implicit goal of changing American foreign policy. I want to open to underscore that by reading three quotations from a paper I wrote in 2014 that I gave at my alma mater, which is Princeton. And it summarizes the main thrust of what I want to say here today. The first quotation is from the diplomat in residence at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton. He says, "The world is on the cusp of the most profound shift in global power and influence in a century. Managing this quiet revolution calls for nothing short of a new international system with a radical revision of existing institutions and patterns of doing business." Now this underscores an important point which I want to make. Asia was a major recipient of prosperity during the last 70 years or so, since the end of, more than that, since the end of World War II. It became not a collection of ex-colonial countries, but it had a gross domestic product. If you just take East Asia, I'm not talking about India, I could do that too, but just East Asia, their gross domestic product is almost equal to ours, and they have grown. The three fastest growing countries in the world were South Korea, Japan, and China, and they grew at speeds unprecedented. We consider ourselves lucky if we make it to 4 or 5%. Each of these countries averaged for several decades between 10 and 14%. And now China has gone from being just a divided, unprosperous nation to being the second largest economy in the world. And they did this, remember, they did this with the government directing it. Now, any of you who either taught or listened to economic professors were told that anyone who interferes with the marketplace is distorting the market. It's a punishment. how do you think these three countries did it? By leadership from the government. And they are very likely to continue to do this, contrary to what we are being taught in 98% of American schools. And it's partly a cultural issue. Let me go on, because the second quotation is from a very famous author, Rudyard Kipling. Oh, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. The motion was for Kipling, who was an apologist for British colonialism, that we lived in a world that was different, that the cultures of Asia, particularly those centered, were not like ours. So what has our policy been? Well, to make them like us. Now, if you think you can go into another culture and transform it into something like your culture, good luck. I hope you've got a century or two to work on it. Now, you have shared interests, but you don't have necessarily shared cultures. Yet this is not only the policy of Rudyard Kipling, it was the policy of the United States. It still is our policy. When we go into Afghanistan and Iran, we hold elections. Afghanistan had 37% of people that were literate. They had to have pictures to show who the candidates were. And yet we thought that this would make them peaceful and like us. Right. The third quote is, the Asian crash, because this was written in 2014, as I was attending a meeting in Richmond. The Asian crash was an intellectual event as much as an economic one. It put an end to the belief that Asian economies could be run along lines different than others. Markets forced the convergence of all things, of prices and of values. This was written or stated by Michael Lewis, a very famous author, in the New York Times Magazine article. Now, he just contradicted everything I just said to you, which is absurd. But today, I suspect that in this audience, more people know the names of the baseball players in the World Series than they do about Asia. It's not your fault. The news is focused on narrowly on America and not even addressing the changes that have taken place. Now let me give you some perspective on that. Asia is, first of all, I have some figures here which I did not give to you. I have way too much. The size of Asia economically today, just East Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, their gross domestic product is nearly equal to ours. And while Japan is slowed, China is just beginning to grow. She's slowing, but slowing to 4 or 5% instead of the 11 or 10 or 12% she was doing. And there is virtual consensus among international banks and others that by 10 or 15 years that China will be not only bigger than the United States, but they may actually be comparable to the entire Western world, because the EU has not been the primary place for American exports since 1979. It's been Asia, and very few people know this. So we have become much more an Asian-oriented thing. Now, what Lewis says is standard fare for most people in this country, that we think we can remake people Now let me start back on the thing I handed out to you and talk about what we did with Japan. My argument is that our policy toward Asia was provoked both in timing and in substance by what went on in Asia, not by what we thought about with great minds in the State Department and the government in Washington, D.C. And this is very easy to prove. Let's start with what we first did for Japan in World War II. A very famous person named Lurie, who founded, he was a media mogul before we had television. He founded Time Magazine and Fortune and had great connections with the government. He coined the phrase, America's century, in 1942, before the world ended. Now, our policy prior to World War II, American policy, even though we were the largest economy in the world, really from the latter part of the 19th century, was that be isolationist, not to get involved. World War II changed that. And as soon as that ended, we changed our policy from isolationism to aggressiveness. And let's see what this meant in Asia. Well, what we did to the Japanese, which was appalling, but it emanated from the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. You locked up 127,000 Japanese in concentration camps in the United States, surrounded by wire and by military people for 4 years. That subsequently has been repudiated, and there's someone here, is May here today or not? There she is, yeah. Well, she is an example. She was born in one of the camps. All right, so the war ended. So what did we do? Well, Japan was very rough stuff in their colonial occupations in Asia. Korea, for example, the Korean language was outlawed, and Japanese had to be spoken. That started in 1932. And so we said we would have to change the culture of Japan. What I just said a little moment ago, what Lewis has said, and what is commonly accepted. So we occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, 7 years, with the explicit purpose of changing their culture. Now, we did give Japanese women the right to vote. We changed the rules of decision-making in the Diet from consensus, which is leadership from the top and agreement from the bottom, to majority rule, and capitalism. But again, the Japanese government was the leader, not the other Zaibatsu, the big companies, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and the other companies that gave Japan industrialization before any other nation other than the Western world. Now, we spent $885 billion to change the Japanese culture. When we looked, and then we had an alliance, a good alliance. The alliance is very good, except we were punitive. We said that Shinto nationalism, Shinto was a Japanese religion that was converted to be nationalistic, focused on the emperor and on expansion of their country, which they said was different. And so we said you can't have an army. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution said Japan was prevented from having an army. Now, morally, this sounds really sensible. But what happened? Well, Japan still has no army. But when the Cold War ended in 1989, The Japanese had spent 1% of their annual budget on the Army. We had spent 8% in the Cold War. The Japanese per capita GDP, and this is in nominal, not just purchasing parity, PP terms, I'll get to that in a moment, was 30% bigger than that of the United States, but we were underwriting the entire defense of Japan. Now that's good work if you can get it. Anybody that's nuts enough to say they're going to defend you completely because you can't defend yourself, so we'll spend all the money you need. That's insanity. But that's literally what happened in 1989, 1990, when the Cold War ended. The Japanese had succeeded brilliantly economically, partly with trade with America, which was a problem. I'll get to that later. But the movement from being incarcerating all Japanese for 4 years and then seeking somehow to change their culture, and spent today it would cost you what we spent about 4 or 5 trillion, and is something you read about in comic books. I mean, I don't, but that was our official policy. Now, to be sure, the Japanese benefited enormously. We had some trade problems with them, particularly in the 1970s. They basically took over a dominant position in cars and various other things. Why? Well, here we go again. Our literacy rate in the United States today, I'm sure it's not true for people sitting in this room, but is 78% at best. What do you think it is in Asia? 95 to 98%. Now, we have a president who said we want to make revolution our production. If you've got countries that are 98% literate and have salaries that are a third of ours, how successful are you going to be? I mean, again, it's almost on the verge of insanity that anybody would seriously propose such a thing if they knew any of the facts that are involved in this business. And I'll get to leadership a little bit longer. But our relationship with Japan has been good. I mean, I divide, and I'll break my train of thought here and explain to you what's on the front page of what I circulated. I divided our phases of relations with Asia into 3. The first one is I call the worm's eye view. It doesn't get any lower than a worm. And that's what we did during World War II and in the efforts to change the culture. And I extend that to Vietnam. What we did in Vietnam is unbelievable. This is an anecdote which will wake you up and make you remember things. I worked for the Rockefeller family. I did 2 books for them about Asia and our foreign policy. I became too well known as a specialist on American policy toward Asia, and I've been involved in not only in Washington, D.C., but in virtually all of the countries of East Asia as an important advisor. That's, if I talk to myself, I would agree, but the messages I've communicated, including 4 or 5 in the White House and many in Congress, this is water on the sand. Well, we went, there's an overlap, because what we did that was good, was really brilliant in our foreign policy, was we dictated the contents of the United Nations Charter. And in it, we underscored the right of all countries, the requirement of all countries, to be self-determination. In other words, it was anti-colonial. And we pushed that. We alienated the French and the British. And the anecdote I'll tell you is that I was interviewed by Nelson Rockefeller, who at the time was governor of New York State, later vice president. He and his four other brothers put together close to $100 million to have a commission on critical choices for Americans. And much of it was on domestic stuff, but they had 4 people on foreign stuff, and I was one of them. And when I was interviewed, it was a good interview, and then he made the mistake of asking me where I stood on the Vietnam War. And I said, well, I was against it, but not for all of the reasons that people, young men didn't even know where it was. Most Americans didn't know where Vietnam was. And they had no idea why they should go there to be shot or killed or anything else. But my difference, I said yes, and yes, obviously, a persuasive reason. But I have 2 other reasons. He said, well, what are they? And I said, sir, how do you spend the 4th of July? He looked at me like I was from Mars. He said, what are you talking about? We're talking about policy toward Asia. No, I said, what do you do on the 4th of July? It's a question. So he said, well, I celebrate our freedom from England. I said, that's right, it was anti-colonial. Isn't this an anti-colonial activity? It's our national holiday on the 4th of July. And what was Vietnam? Well, sure, it was funded, trained by the Kremlin and Beijing, but it was an anti-colonial war. And what did we do? First thing we did was we replaced the colonizers. We became the colonizer, not the colony it was for. And I said, but the second reason is even worse. It's when we got involved in the war, it was very unusual. It was not everybody had different uniforms on, and you knew who the enemy was, and you know, we had battle lines and so forth. No, it was everybody in Vietnam was potentially an enemy. And to fight a strategic war like that is very different. It's kind of like what Trump is doing with the National Guard and making them policemen. I mean, it's just, they're not trained to do it. And he said, yes. Well, what's this got to do? I said, well, we found a pamphlet that told us how to fight there. And he said, well, how did we get it so fast? I said, well, we translated it from the French. So not only did we replace France, but we copied their pamphlet on how to fight a war that they blew in Vietnam and in Algeria. And I said, and you wonder why there were problems. How did we lose? How did we get involved? I tell you this anecdote, and then he jumped up. The good line is he jumped up and ran at me, and I thought I was going to get beaten up by the richest guy in America. And he put his arm around me and said to Nancy, Henry's wife, Nancy Kissinger, he said, this guy, I disagree with him on some details, but I've never thought like this before. Give him anything he wants. And he did. I mean, I was given an open-ended budget, and I produced reports and testimonies and books. I did 2 books for him and so on about foreign policy in the region. But that's an example that illustrates the point I'm trying to make. I was costumed yesterday wearing a Husky shirt that was given to me by one of my 5 grandkids. And then I had a thing in my hand, which was a bizarre, it's those of you who are Japanese, at Fukurokuju. It was a statue of a scholar, and it had a giant head on it, because scholars are supposed to be smart. And I put a sticker on the back of it. Unfortunately, I left it sitting in my desk in my room, which said, "This is a U-House battle image," because it's an elderly man who has a big head on him, who knows a lot. This is why I'm talking here today, to try to encourage you to learn more about Asia. And it could be used to awaken people to understand what the future holds for us. Now, we did a pretty good job. Even though Vietnam was at it, we deployed huge numbers of troops to Guam, to South Korea, and of course Japan. And Southeast Asia, we had for years a Subic Bay port that helped our naval there. And of course, the most interesting one is right here in Puget Sound, where we have nuclear aircraft carriers. And here's another kind of anecdotal footnote. Trident submarines that are stationed just on the other side of the sound carry several rockets, all of which are multi-armed. That means they range from 4 to 8 hydrogen bombs. A hydrogen bomb, if it were dropped on Seattle, say they dropped it on Bremerton, 100 miles in each direction would all be affected. Nuclear strategic war is absolutely unthinkable if it were to occur. Yet we're spending billions of dollars so it doesn't happen. But I'm telling you that we're going to go from Japan to Korea. But our Japanese policy has worked well. Japan has flourished at our expense, and they are strong allies. And of course, I mean, they did everything for Trump. I mean, they flattered him and treated him well. So did the Koreans. It's not so much substantive as it is personal to get an agreement. So Japan has been approached, ironically, on assumptions that were simply not in violation of what Lewis said. Their economy, it's called the developmental economy, was brilliantly run, and people in the government, the Ministry of Economic Industry, ran it. In other words, they succeeded not by copying us, but by doing things on their terms in the context of a global economy and, of course, our bilateral relations. Now let's shift to Korea. We didn't pay much attention to Korea after the war. Korea, from 1910 to the end of World War II, had been a colony of Japan. And the Koreans were controlled roughly by the Japanese. But we concentrated instead on Japan, disarming it, writing a constitution contrary to the UN Charter that blocked them from arming themselves. And then we didn't pay much attention to Korea. We reduced our troops that were fighting Japan in Korea to 2 battalions. So not too surprisingly, Joseph Stalin urged Kim Jong-il, one of the first of Kim's, there now must be the grandson of Kim Jong-il. They imposed a communist-trained leader on North Korea, and they refused to hold a plebiscite as required under the UN decision. We, on the other hand, did that in South Korea, and when we reduced our military presence, Stalin pushed the North to invade the South, which he did, and they quickly overran Korea. At that point, the United States decided maybe we'd better get involved. And Douglas MacArthur, who was the military and political commander of our occupation in Japan, was put in charge. MacArthur brilliantly drove the Koreans back to North Korea and liberated the South. But then he got ambitious. And he said, I've never lost a war, and I'm not going to start on this one. So he encouraged American troops to go into North Korea. Well, while this was going on, Mao Zedong was winning the civil war in China. And he sneaked in 250,000 troops without our knowledge. And we were slaughtered. This is where most of our casualties happened in the Korean War, because we were overextended and the Chinese just, but to underscore this again as a minor diversion, I met, while I was in Korea as a soldier, I met another career soldier who had been involved in the North Korean excursion. The Chinese had just taken over. They haven't even consolidated their positions in China. But, so they had one rifle for 10 people. And this guy had a machine gun, and he said, I spent 8 hours a day mowing down, killing people, who then took the rifles from the bodies of their colleagues and kept fighting. He tried to come back to the United States. He said, I could not adjust to the civilian world. And he re-enlisted and was asked to be deployed to it. So what happened was the Korean War became a war between China and the United States. And not unsurprisingly, we never even diplomatically recognized China until 1978. It was almost 30 years, because we fought a war with them. And which is still ended in an armistice. It's never been concluded formally. And Korea remains, to this day, a military satellite of the United States. We have a huge deployment of American soldiers there, and we are bound to fight if the war were to break out again in Korea. All right, now let's go to China, because China in many ways is China is the most transformed. China was a mess when the war ended. It was divided. I mean, there were at that time 1.5 billion Chinese, and they were divided linguistically in other ways. There was no central controlling force, military or otherwise. The Germans, the Europeans, and the United States had become exploiters of China. And they continued after the war to be kind of frozen in place, as it were. We tried, of course insanely, we tried to mediate the Chinese Civil War by sending General Maxwell Taylor, who was our genius in World War II, to try to mediate a civil war in a country like China that had been going on for decades. Needless to say, we lost, or Mao won, and that's why, and then we never even had relations until Nixon and Kissinger went there in '71, but only symbolically, because Kissinger said China had in '78 said we're going to make money now, and had adopted, and we accepted their entry into the global economy. And China prospered mightily for 3 or 4 decades and became the second largest economy in the world. And it's going to be, if there is a solution to Asia and America, it's going to be one decided between the United States and China. And good luck. That's all I can say. I should have interrupted footnote. I suddenly realized I have a paper here. I've written so many papers on this stuff. I wrote a crazy paper called the American-Japanese Alliance, a coelacanth. Nobody in this room knows it. Coelacanth is a living fossil. They live off the coast of Indonesia and off the coast of Africa in lava caves. They're still alive, and they cannot survive if they're taken out of the environment in which they live. This was only discovered in the 1930s. Needless to say, the Japanese immediately went over and tried to capture one to put on display, and they failed. But I described the Japanese-American alliance as the equivalent of a coelacanth. That is, that it was designed to deal with the world as perceived in the 1940s, not today. And yet we have not changed a single word. Now, Japanese haven't either, but if you had a deal like that, why would you want to change it? I mean, I give them A++ for not doing it. I throw that in because I want to underscore the importance of understanding how things should have changed but didn't change. Now, China has become the dominant player in Asia. They are the leading trading partner of every country in Asia, including the Philippines, replacing first the United States, which was the case in the 60s, then Japan, which was the case in the 70s and 80s, now it's China. And they will remain a dominant player there. And believe it or not, I was invited by the Chinese government in 2019 to go to Beijing and advise them on how to implement their Belt and Road Initiative, which is their strategic foreign policy. And I was invited back 2 more times, 3 trips to China, talking to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is their premier think tank on strategy. It was, I ended it, the meeting, the Professor Liu, who was the head of it and the chief advisor to Xi Jinping on foreign affairs, came in and called me names, and American apologist and all that stuff. And so finally I said to him, "Sir, may I ask you one question?" And he avoided it. And finally I said, "Sir, I want to ask you a question, just one." So he said, "Okay, what is your question?" I said, "Well, you say you're going to take over from us because we have, an idiot for president, and we're capitalists that can't make it. But the issue is really the West. By then I mean Europe and the United States, and people in this room, overwhelming number of people in this room, dominated the modern international system. Nationalism, communism, colonialism, every ism was simply the verbalization of the uneven distribution of wealth and international power derivative from the Industrial Revolution, period. Now we are in a new revolution. It's called the digital revolution. And the question I asked of the gentleman was, sir, can you tell me what the world is going to be like in 2049 when you claim you're going to take over from the United States? Silence was deafening, and others raised questions. And finally, I wish I were making this up, I ended my talk, and they said, we want to hire you. I said, I beg your pardon. He said, we want you to come here and advise us what to do since we don't know. I said, well, I don't know any more than you do. Why would you do that to me? I mean, nobody knows. Bill Gates didn't discover the cell phone for 6 years. And I said, nobody, even people that are techies in the fullest sense of the word, has any understanding. And it's not just who discovers the next quantum formula or the AI formula refined. It's how this is accepted by people, and how like the cell phone now defines even autocracies. I mean, because people can find out what's going on, and it's produced our president, in my opinion, because people can not be held accountable for facts; they can just talk, and so on. So the idea, my point is, we are in another technological revolution. And Asia is going to be a critical player in it. China may very well, even Japan for that matter, may very well be the one that breaks through with whatever is possible. So people had better wake up and pay attention. And I think I must be running out of time. I'll just about mention that the European Union, which is like us, is much smaller than Asia in terms of our needs and certainly our role in the world. And its practice, its gross domestic product is only about 70% of that of the United States today. And their population is substantially bigger than ours. The population of Asia, on the other hand, and forget about India, which is the largest country in the world now. Asia has, East Asia, Southeast Asia and East Asia has a population of over 2 billion. I mean, they're 6 times, or 7 times the size of the United States. And the purchasing power in China is higher than it is in the United States, even though the nominal power is the nominal difference is that. I will end on that, and that what do I call the phase of American relations with Asia? I call it, and this is because of Trump, I try to figure out some way to embody Trump. So I called it the emu period. Now, an emu is a flightless bird that is really an unevolved dinosaur. It buries its head in sand and so on. Now, if my memoir is published, there may be people knocking at the door here because I will elaborately explain why he is an emu and not a human being because of the way he is behaving. Well, let me end on that and just remind you that the reading, the thing I've given you,
is an outline, not of what I've just said, but it's an outline of what you should know about East Asia. And that's all I can hope for. This is more like a class I taught for over 50 years at the University of Washington. And I hope you have enjoyed it. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd explain what emu meant. I love it. Comments and questions?
I really want to thank you for this because, like all of us in the room, I've had a good education. I've traveled around the world. I thought I knew a lot. I don't. And I think your way of presenting this was really helpful to me because I realized I'm probably not the only one who doesn't understand. So thank you.
Thank you. It was my purpose to do that. I've written too many books and papers, detailed papers about the subject. But I went to public schools when I grew up in the Central City. Asia was a footnote, if that. Then I went to Princeton, and I had one course that was the superficial history of China and Japan. And the only way I got involved was some officer deployed me to Uijeonbu, Korea, where I observed and then read extensively and decided I better go get a PhD in politics with a capacity for speaking a language. And I might add, just as a comment, I said I'd like to learn Chinese because Chinese is really the basis of both Korean and Japanese. And they told me at Berkeley that I would have to learn traditional Chinese before I could even begin to study modern Chinese. So I suggested a good bridge where they could jump. And they said, but we'll give you a full fellowship in Japanese because they had been given money by the Japanese government. So, and then that's how I got dragged into this. And most people, and certainly the news, the media, are utterly uninformed. And not because they're stupid, that's just the way they're oriented. Go ahead.
I did want to ask you some thoughts about what went on with that meeting, that famous meeting of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
Oh,
What are your thoughts about the outcome of that?
Well, she must be really smiling. Because, as I understand it, the rare metals agreement is for 1 year. And he can think about that. The rare metals argument relates to our security relations. It is absolutely fundamental to building planes, drones, ships, everything. And she now has the option to do what he wants with it. And what we did, I mean, he got soybeans or something. That was so stupid, and there, of course, there's political lies that the farmers have been complaining about it. But you can grow soybeans in Argentina, you can grow soybeans in America, you can grow it in lots of places. So it's not a strategy. We don't have a strategy. I mean, we just go there and say things. Well, Trump doesn't know what he's going to say until he talks to someone the same day. And but I can assure you, one final comment, he's got huge tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And many of the tariffs on Mexico are Chinese-owned manufacturing units. Huge numbers. They have a strategy. They've invested in Latin America. They've invested in Africa. they built infrastructure in Africa. They're not going to copy Chinese communism, but they certainly are going to outsmart us in terms of surviving in an interdependent world, which we're stuck with, whether we like it or not.
Just another example of the art of the deal.
Yes.
Anybody else have a comment or a question? I enjoyed your viewpoint on this.
I went to school, I started schooling just after the war in America occupied Japan. And then I remember our generation, they said we got the best education because America gave us individuality and democracy. And I also remember we are so proud we got the best generation in Japan. And then another thing is that people forget when 1960s and 50s and 60s, Japanese government emphasis on education. And those people educated, they bloomed in 1980s Japan's prosperity. So education is so important, I think. Yeah.
That's
Yeah, that's my small
well,
experience.
I've discussed this with other Asian people in this country. The Asians that live in America, incidentally, that they were allowed to become citizens only in the 1960s. People don't really understand. They were here in some numbers, but until the immigration law of 1965 was passed, then large numbers of Asians, they are number one in education, in arms, or money. They have the lowest number of people in prison, and part of it is just the internal values that are imposed as juxtaposed. And so it's interesting, but they are isolated internationally, and their education system is good, but Japan is shrinking. I laugh because I'm in my 90s, but if I live to be 110 or 120, I will disappear because I'm shrinking. And I think Japan is also shrinking. And therefore, but if, for example, to answer your question, if Trump were to provoke Korea, who did everything they could to cultivate him, they could develop a nuclear weapon probably in 6 weeks. And if Korea had developed a nuclear weapon, I don't predict, I guarantee you Japan will. And then you will have a change in the political situation in Japan, and you will have an East Asia that has surrounded itself, well, internally with nuclear powers. I might add Taiwan, which we haven't talked about, is 23 million people. They too, in the 70s, had to be blocked from developing a nuclear weapon like the Koreans by the United States. That was very, very good. But if Trump plays around in this pressure on this and that and so on and so forth, then it's going to be very exciting. But no one probably doesn't even know where Asia is on a map. I mean, I don't get into that.
Anyone else? Okay, coming.
Do you attach significance to a woman being elected?
I think I'm glad you asked the question. That's real. For the first time in history, there is a woman prime minister of Japan. And that just happened 2 weeks ago. And I've done as much research as I can on her. What is interesting, first of all, she's a woman. That's item one. How did the ruling Liberal Democratic Party allow a woman to become president. She is probably the most conservative member of the Liberal Democratic Party there is. And she favors reviving the accounts of Japanese cruelty during World War II. And she is, in foreign affairs, in any event, is very, very conservative. In other words, she's remarkable. She's not hereditary. I mean, most prime ministers in Japan come from families that have been prime ministers or related to prime ministers before them. And so it's more astonishing for me that a woman who is not hereditary politician she strikes me as being very interesting, limited in what initiatives she can do, but symbolic. I mean, it makes the United States, we've become one of the few major countries not to have a woman as president. Instead, we have Trump, which I don't know what he is.
What series of political events or economic events would be sufficient to cause the increasing number of oligarchs in America to realize that Trump's policies are so seriously deficient that a reversal politically needs to take place in this country?
Whoa!
I wish I could answer the question.
I wish you could too.
I was struck. I'll tell you another anecdote. In the late 70s,
Put the microphone closer.
in the late 70s, early 80s, the Prime Minister of Japan was a man named Takeo Fukui, in Western Ireland. And I had interviewed him. I'd written about him, and I knew. So I got a call from
I'm sorry.
his committee team from Portland, and he said, "Is there something we haven't been told that you can tell us? Because I know you always are blunt in your assessments." And I said, "No, I can't do anything like that." So then I thought about it, and we had as our president, for whom I might add I voted, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer for a living. He did graduate from Annapolis, but he only had 2 years as governor of Georgia. Fukui went to Tokyo University. He was in the Hogakubu, the combination political science law arrangement there. He was first in his class. He took the civil service test. He was #1 in the country. He was a senior bureaucrat in the Ministry of Finance, the most prestigious, effective thing. He was foreign minister. He spoke 4 languages. And then he was coming to see Jimmy. Now, Jimmy was a nice guy. He got eaten alive by Washington. But to answer your question, unless we elect somebody who either themselves or surrounds themselves with people who are knowledgeable to do as Trump is doing, saying, I'm a great friend of Xi Jinping and I can talk to him, I don't know what, hug him or something, and he will do what I want to do. That's not the way the world works. And my answer to you is, our government in Washington needs to reestablish consulting things that are good. I was asked on television, I don't think it was on the West Coast, what I thought of Trump's triumph over Harris. And I said, well, I know everybody thinks, his appointments to cabinets, he chose the most incompetent person he could find, not the most capable. So I'm not going to comment on that. But I will suggest one thing, and this is partially answering your question. That with Trump as president, we should have another cabinet position. And he said, well, what is that? I said, psychiatry. I said, your answer to the question means you can't have a president who is semi-literate and who surrounds himself. That won't work.
Generous.
Now, if that changes, make it through 4 years, we'll be fine. Okay.
Is there anybody in Trump's cabinet who has any knowledge?
I don't understand a guy like Bassett, who is a very shrewd and established advisor on Wall Street. I don't understand how these people put up with this stuff. But they beguiled by power, and I guess, I don't know, but certainly it doesn't, there is no common sense. It's an agenda that is set by events, not by our policy. And that the message that I'm saying, that's the way I got around to emu. Emus are unevolved dinosaurs. They live as they did millions of years ago. And above all, they can't fly. And Trump denies globalism and says nationalism is the only way. That's insane. It's not a policy, it's technology.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you very much.